Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello. I'm your host, Cat, and this is Cat Has Questions. So, today we're going back to June of 1912 to a small town called Villisca, Iowa, where one night turned into one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. The Villisca Axe Murders weren't just brutal, they were methodical, silent, and completely unresolved. And an entire household was wiped out while they slept. The killer vanished before sunrise, and what was left behind was a house, a handful of theories, and more questions than answers. So today, we're walking through what happened that night, and the theories of who could have done it. This is the story Villisca never got to finish. This is the Villisca Axe Murders. So, the house stood on a quiet corner in Villisca, a small town stitched together by railroad ties, church socials, and the reassuring rhythm of predictability. It was the kind of place where people noticed if your curtains stayed drawn too long, where strangers were remembered and gossip traveled faster than the trains that cut through the town. The Moore house sat just off of 2nd Street. It was a modest, white frame home with a wide front porch and a tidy yard. It would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. On Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the house was full. Josiah Moore was 43 years old. He was a successful businessman who sold agricultural equipment. He was known around town, respected, ambitious, sometimes described as stern but fair. His wife, Sarah, was 39, quieter, deeply religious, and devoted to her children. They had 4 of them. Herman was 11, and he was serious and responsible, an eldest sibling kind of personality. Catherine, 10, bright and eager. Hey, shout out to the name twinsies. Boyd, 7, energetic and affectionate. And then finally, Paul, who was 5, the baby of the family. That evening, the Moore children had begged for something special. After church, they wanted to bring friends home for the night, a small treat to cap off the weekend before the routine of Monday returned. So, 2 girls were invited for a sleepover, Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters aged 12 and 8. Their parents agreed. I know we all remember those times when we had to beg our parents to let our friends sleep over, and how exciting it was when they would finally let you do it. The girls packed small overnight bags and followed the Moore family back to the house as dusk settled over Villisca. Inside the home, it was filled with noise. Footsteps on the stairs, whispered jokes, the rustle of nightgowns, the scrape of chairs being pushed under the dining table. Lamps were lit, prayers were said, and the house settled into sleep somewhere just after 10 p.m. No one locked the doors. They rarely did, and this wasn't uncommon in a small town like this in Midwestern Iowa. So they all went to bed after 10. Sometime after midnight, no one knows exactly when, but someone approached the Moore house. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Whoever came inside did so quietly and deliberately, without alerting the sleeping family. The weapon was already in the house, an axe. Typically stored near the woodpile, it was taken inside. Later, investigators would note something unsettling. The killer used the blunt side of the axe for most of the attacks, not the blade. It was as if the intent was not efficiency, but control and silence. I know we're talking about a literal axe murderer, but what kind of psychopath uses the blunt side of the axe to murder a family? But the killer moved room by room. First the parents, Josiah and Sarah Moore. They slept in their bed on the 1st floor, and unfortunately they never woke up. The blows came down hard, crushing bone, ending their lives where they lay. Blood was soaked into the bedding, the mattress, and the floorboards beneath. But the killer unfortunately did not stop there. He moved upstairs. In the children's room, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul lay asleep in 2 beds. They had been tucked in after prayers. Their nightclothes were still neat when their bodies were found. One by one, they were struck. Some evidence suggested that at least one child must have stirred or possibly woke up briefly, but there were no signs of escape, and no one made it out of the bed. Then the guest room. Lena and Ina Stillinger slept together in the bed that they had been offered for the night. But unfortunately, they too were also killed with the same weapon in the same brutal method. 8 people, 8 victims. When it was over, the killer did something that still unsettles investigators more than a century later. He covered the mirrors. So a cloth was placed over all of the glass in the More home, including mirrors, even windows. Some people believe this was ritualistic. Others think it was practical, or an attempt to avoid seeing his own reflection. Food was taken from the kitchen, a slab of bacon that was left uneaten. Water was poured. An oil lamp was left without its chimney. Its soot later found near the scene. Then the killer washed up and left, and the house fell silent again. So morning comes to Villisca. Monday, June 10th, dawned like any other summer morning. The Stillinger girls didn't come home, though. Their parents assumed the girls had overslept. They waited a little bit longer, but by late morning, concern edged into worry. Around 8 a.m., Mary Peckham, a neighbor, noticed something odd at the More house. The curtains were still drawn. Josiah hadn't come out to start his day. The house just felt wrong. This was not their typical routine. So Mary knocked. No answer. And she tried the door, but it was locked, which obviously was weird because nobody locked their doors. Mary alerted Ross More, so Josiah's brother, who lived nearby. Together, they attempted to peer inside, but eventually Ross had to force entry into the home. What he saw sent him running back out of the house, shouting for help. Word spread really fast. Within minutes, townspeople crowded around the property. There was no perimeter, no crime scene tape, no concept of preserving evidence at this time. So people literally went inside the house. They walked through blood, they touched things, they moved bodies. Some cried, obviously. Some stared in stunned silence. Some explicably took souvenirs like psychopaths. By the time authorities arrived, the house was irrevocably compromised. The sheriff vomited when he entered the bedroom. That's how horrific this was. Doctors confirmed what was already obvious. All 8 victims were dead, likely killed sometime after midnight. The injuries were catastrophic. Skulls crushed, faces unrecognizable. And the town of Villisca would never be the same. News of the murders spread very fast beyond Iowa. Newspapers across the country seized on the story. 8 people, a whole family, 2 visiting children, no suspect, no motive, no explanation whatsoever. Doors were locked for the first time in living memory. Guns were cleaned and loaded. Night watches formed. People slept in shifts, afraid that whoever had done this might still be nearby. So this really affected the town and affected people's trust. And then the rumors began. Some said it had to be personal. Others said it couldn't be. Who could hate a family enough to do this, as well as 2 random girls who, how would they even know that the girls were going to be there? Attention turned to Josiah Moore's business dealings. Had he cheated somebody, made an enemy, or been targeted for his success? Then there were whispers of something darker. The way the mirrors were covered, the way the axe was used, the quietness of it all. This wasn't rage, some said. This was methodical. So the list of suspects grew long and strange. Long before names were spoken, the town leaned instinctively toward a stranger. Villisca sat on a railroad line. Trains came and went daily, bringing salesmen, laborers, preachers, men with no reason to stay, and no one who would miss them if they left. The idea was comforting in a way, evil passing through, not growing from within the town or somebody that everybody knows. People remembered hearing footsteps late at night, a shadow near the tracks, a man seen walking alone after midnight. This theory hardened when investigators noticed something unsettling. The Villisca murders were not unique. Across the Midwest, families had been slaughtered in eerily similar ways. Axes taken from victims' homes, attacks carried out while people slept, mirrors covered, doors left unlocked. Colorado, Kansas, Illinois, which I'm going to get into these in a little bit later, just kind of like the similarities between some of these. So the killer, some believed, wasn't from Villisca at all. He was moving. and Villisca was just a stop. If that's true, then the More house wasn't targeted, it was just selected. A light on, a door unlocked, a quiet street near the railroad tracks. Kind of just opportunity, not vengeance. But that theory required accepting something worse, that the killer was just never going to be caught if he just hopped on the train and left town. The next suspect is a man who preached a little too loudly. Reverend George Kelly arrived in Villisca like many others, passing through, briefly noticed, easily forgotten until he wasn't. Kelly was a traveling minister, unmarried, socially awkward, and prone to intense religious fixations. He preached the night of June 9th, speaking about sin and damnation with a fervor some townspeople later said felt off. He did stay in that town overnight, and then came a confession. So this was actually years after the murders happened. Kelly was arrested and questioned, and under intense interrogation, he admitted to the killing of the More family. He gave details that only the killer might know. He spoke of visions of being compelled, but then he ended up recanting that. He said he was confused, he said he'd been pressured, and he said he hadn't actually done it after all. Authorities were not sure what to believe, and Kelly did have a history of mental instability. He also had no physical evidence tying him to the house. No blood, no witnesses placing him there. But to be fair, based on how it sounded like they literally had people just like walking around in the crime scene, not sure how much physical evidence they could have tying him to it. The confession dissolved under scrutiny, but doubt always lingered. Because if Kelly was the killer, then the murders weren't strategic or personal. They were just compulsive. A moment where belief tipped into violence. And then the whole house paid the price. Okay, so next theory is that if the killer wasn't passing through, like the man on the train, then maybe he'd already been inside long before that night. Frank Jones had once been Josiah Moore's business partner. Together, they sold farm equipment. Together, they built something profitable. And then they split badly. Jones was rumored to be furious about money, about commissions and contracts and being pushed out kind of the business. In a small town, business disagreements don't stay professional. They become personal, and people take sides. Jones had power in Villisca. He had friends, he had influence, and he had an alibi that depended on other people backing it up. Some people believe Jones didn't swing the axe himself, like he could have hired somebody, a drifter, a hired hand, someone disposable. If Jones was behind it, the murders were not random at all. They were revenge. Josiah first, then the witnesses, then the children, because you can't leave the, unfinished business. It's the darkest version of motive because it suggests intent that extended beyond rage into calculation. But like every theory, it stopped short of proof. Suspicion isn't evidence, and Villisca never found the bridge between the two. So another theory, this theory places the killer inside the house before anybody went to bed. Maybe a familiar face, a neighbor, somebody who everybody trusted, someone who knew the layout, who knew where the axe was kept. Because like I said, if you remember, they did not bring this with them. They found the axe at the house. So someone who knew the family's routines well enough to move without hesitation. This theory grows from small details, the lack of forced entry, the calm movement from room to room, the way the killer seemed unhurried and comfortable. And if you remember, they ate at the table, they sat at the porch, someone who had been inside enough times to feel invisible. And the idea here isn't rage or insanity, it's familiarity. This is a theory that people don't like to talk about because it means evil didn't arrive by train. It maybe just lived nearby. So moving on to the ritual theory. Some investigators were really fixated on what happened after the murders. The mirrors covered, which is just weird. The windows draped, the food left out, the lamp chimney removed. These weren't necessary actions. They didn't help the person escape. They didn't really serve a practical purpose, unless they meant something. This theory suggests the killer believed in something, either symbols, rituals, superstitions, that he wasn't just killing, but performing. Covering mirrors to avoid the soul, blocking windows to keep something in or out, eating afterward as a grounding act. If this theory is true, the killer wasn't focused on the Moores at all. They were part of something larger, something internal, and something unfinished. And unfortunately, that house was maybe just the stage. I also wonder, though, sometimes I feel like killers will cover mirrors or cover the victims' heads and stuff because they're like a little bit like they realize what they've done is wrong. So like, could he just like be not wanting to see himself in the mirrors? I don't know. Then there's one final theory, though it's less of a theory and more of an admission, that the killer was never on the suspect list at all, that the real perpetrator passed through quietly, left no trace, and died years later under a different name in a different place. That the case was doomed the moment the townspeople walked through the house in that morning, touching what should have been preserved. If that's true, then Villisca didn't fail to solve the crime. It was just never solvable. Every theory fits some of the facts. None fit all of them. And so the house remains full of shadows, each one shaped like a different man, each one asking the same question, though. I think maybe the most unsettling possibility of all of this is the killer heard the house settle, they waited, they listened for 8 people breathing, and knew that by morning, no one would be able to recognize him or identify him. So, of all these suspects that we've talked about, who's the most plausible? If we strip away vibes, town gossip, coerced confessions, and he just felt creepy energy, because obviously we all know people who have creepy energy, but that does not mean that they have murdered an entire family with an axe. If we look at pattern, opportunity, and behavior, the most plausible answer is likely a transient serial offender moving around along the railroad lines. Not George Kelly, not Frank Jones, not a neighbor who snapped. Likely a drifter, already practiced, already invisible. But here's why this theory holds up better than the rest of them. No forced entry, suggesting confidence, not necessarily familiarity. The weapon was taken from the home, which is classic in multiple Midwest axe murders. The mirrors covered, kind of ritual-like behavior. Other cases have a similar repeated thing going on. The entire house was targeted, not personal revenge, but it eliminates witnesses. So it's not like, I would assume that if Frank Jones was mad about his business partner, why do you need to kill his kids? Another thing that helps this theory hold up is the railroad access. So like I said, this town has a railroad track running through it. Their house was pretty close to it. So easy arrival, easy escape, no ties to the town. And no solid alibi is needed. So no one knew who it was to begin with, so they don't need an alibi. If this was a serial offender, Villisca wasn't the crime. It was chapter 1. So I definitely had to do a little deep dive once I read about the possibility of this axe murder being tied to other unresolved cases. And there is unfortunately a scary amount of them nearby in the Midwest. Some are discussed as potentially linked to the Villisca Axe murders, and I'll explain what happened, why they're considered connected, and where the similarities start to feel uncomfortable. It helps to know why investigators and historians even entertain a connection. So across the late 1890s through 1912, when this murder happened, dozens of families were murdered in their homes at night while sleeping, often with axes taken from the victim's own property with no clear motive. So the killer in each of these entered quietly, used a household axe, targeted entire households, left very little evidence, and then disappeared. So Villisca may not have been at the beginning, but it may have been the last known stop. Okay, so the first one is in Monmouth, Illinois in 1911. So this one is the closest pre-Villisca parallels. So in September 1911, a husband, wife, and 3 children were found murdered in their home. They were attacked in their sleep with an axe, so very similar to Villisca, no forced entry, no robbery. The entire household was killed. And as I mentioned, the weapon was believed to be from the property. This crime was never solved, and many researchers consider the Monmouth murders a direct precursor to Villisca. The next one is in Ellsworth, Kansas in 1911. So a married couple was murdered in their sleep with an axe. All very similar. The murder occurred along a railroad corridor, which becomes important when looking at this broader theory. The next one is in Paola, Kansas in 1911. A woman and her 2 children were killed with an axe while sleeping. All similar things, not solved, no solid suspect. An axe was used, no forced entry. This also occurred just months before Villisca. The next is in Colorado Springs. So although it's not really Midwest proper, this case is often included because of the method and the timing. A whole family attacked at night with an axe. And investigators noted the killer appeared familiar with the home layout and moved room to room deliberately. There were several axe murders that occurred in Newark, Ohio. Once again, sleeping victims, household tools used, also relevant when you consider the rail access. And also, if you listen to last week's episode, the Circleville letters actually also were kind of in this area, suggesting the region had been vulnerable to transient offenders. And in Rainier, Washington in 1911, once again, a family was murdered with an axe while they slept. A family annihilation situation, silent entry and exit, though much further west, same behavioral mold. Many of these towns share something critical, and that is that they all sit on an active railroad line. And that matters because the railroad allowed for anonymous travel. Men could move town to town without leaving records. A killer could strike, leave, and never be recognized. And by 1912, rail travel made serial violence possible in a way that it hadn't before, since someone could just hop on and go. Much of the modern linkage theory comes from The Man from the Train by Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James. They argue that one serial offender may have been responsible for dozens of axe murders, so kind of that list of murders I just talked about. Villisca was likely one of the final crimes, if this all is true. And the killer stopped not because he was caught, but possibly because he aged or died or lost mobility to be able to keep murdering people and just hopping on trains. Not everyone agrees, but many investigators concede that a lot of the similarities are too strong to ignore. So why does this matter for the case we're talking about today? If Villisca was part of a series, it explains the lack of motive, it explains why suspects didn't fit cleanly, and it explains why the killer vanished. Villisca doesn't feel unsolved because evidence is missing. It feels unsolved because the answer may never have been in the town to start with. And the hard truth is that there's no proof that these cases are definitely linked, but the pattern is strong enough that Villisca is rarely discussed alone anymore, not just as a one-off, but as the final echo of a killer who learned how to disappear. In the Villisca murders, no one was ever charged, no one was ever convicted. The case went cold until it became a legend. The Moore house did not remain a home. It has changed hands multiple times. Families moved in and moved out just as quickly. Some claimed to hear voices, others said doors slammed on their own, or that objects moved when no one was there. So people were thinking it was haunted, for good reason. Eventually, the house became a tourist attraction. People came to stand in rooms where 8 people had died. They came with cameras, recorders, questions. Some said that the house remembered. Skeptics rolled their eyes, but believers leaned in. But even without ghosts, the house held weight. Because what happened there was never explained, and unresolved violence has a way of lingering. The question Villisca never escaped wasn't what happened, it was who stayed behind after everyone else went to sleep. If the most plausible theory is right, then the answer to Villisca didn't stay in town. It left before sunrise. The killer didn't need to hide or explain or look back. He just stepped onto a train, blended into motion, and let a small Iowa town carry the weight of what he'd done for the next 100 years. 8 people went to sleep believing the world was predictable, and by morning, that certainty was gone forever. Villisca never got a name, only a house, only a date, and an answer that still hasn't arrived. If you have any good stories that you want me to dive into next, shoot me an email at cathasquestionspod@gmail.com or find me on Instagram. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Cat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.